how much do we know about the unintended consequences?
I don't think the government knows what the consequences of this legislation are, let alone the rest of us.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, I'm Ebony Bennett and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. This week's special parliamentary sitting started with tributes to the victims of the Bondi terrorist attacks.
For every person murdered, there are families and friends left behind, a home left quieter, clothes still hanging in wardrobes, photos on walls that will never be updated, children asking when someone is coming home.
To those who ran towards gunshots, to those who shielded, to those who helped, to the first responders, to those who tackled and those who stood up, I say thank you.
Our country will never be the same, nor should it be. The question is who we become now.
And it ended with the passage of two major pieces of legislation. The Greens supported the government's new gun control laws and the Liberals helped pass the new hate speech provisions after Susan Lee's party had a change of heart at the last minute. But with only a week between the government introducing the complex draft legislation and it passing through the parliament, you'd be forgiven for not totally being across all of the details of these bills. In fact, the government was probably counting on it. So what is in these reforms and what do they mean for Australian democracy? Joining me today to answer these questions is Australia Institute Chief Political Analyst Amy Remeikis. G'day, Amy.
Hello.
And also with us is Bill Browne, Director of our Democracy and Accountability Program. G'day, Bill.
Hey, Em.
So obviously last year we saw the horrific events that occurred at Bondi, and in the wake of that, National Cabinet met Bill to discuss further gun law reforms because it was basically the worst mass shooting since Port Arthur. What are in these new laws that will change in terms of gun laws?
So big changes include limiting the ability to import firearms to citizens. They'll be backed up at the state level by limiting licences to Australian citizens, as New South Wales has already done. Restrictions on what type of guns can be imported. So limiting both the kind of technologies and then the firing capacity of the guns. And perhaps most importantly, this big national gun buyback running over 2 years, costing about $1 billion. And looking at how Western Australia's gun buyback went in recent years, they say that about 25% of guns were taken out of circulation. You wouldn't need to have exactly that same ratio at the federal level to still mean that there's many, many fewer guns. And as you say, it'll be backed up by state laws, with New South Wales serving as the example there, or Western Australia, where they've already capped the number of firearms that someone's allowed to own.
Yeah. And Amy, these gun law reforms passed with the support of the Greens. Where was the opposition on the gun law reform in particular?
The opposition was off just making it as political as possible, and there was a lot of misinformation that was coming from elements of the opposition, as was identified by some of the independent MPs, including Helen Haines, who was the only regional non-government MP to vote for these laws. Bridget McKenzie was leading a campaign saying that this was targeting legal gun owners, that this was coming after people who were going hunting, that it was going to stop professional shooters from being able to, do their sport and go to the Olympics, none of which is true. But it did get quite a lot of community support. So Bridget McKenzie tabled a petition into the parliament that had over 60,000 signatures and had not been running for long, mostly based on this misinformation. And in their speeches giving their reasoning for standing against the bill, the opposition were pretty united on the fact that they thought this was just a distraction and that the government was using it to distract from what they were saying was the real cause, radical Islam terrorism, which again was not true. I mean, a lot of these laws were actually also in train for the last couple of years. They were due to come into effect in 2028. National Cabinet had already spoken about some elements of these laws. So things like bringing the National Firearms Register has just been brought forward by 2 years. But the coalition's, split on this particular bill, as opposed to the unity that we saw in 1996, was largely given permission by John Howard, who immediately came out and said this is a distraction, even though it's building on what some would say is his greatest legacy. And it's also spilled over into the LNP-led states, with Queensland, Northern Territory and Tasmania saying that they will not be taking part in the buyback
in the gun
scheme.
buyback.
So they won't be setting up the collection centres for that, which, in 96 we saw a lot of unity. We saw all jurisdictions taking part to ensure that these laws, were unified across the country, and we're not seeing it now, and it's mostly because of politics.
Yeah.
As I've said before, there are more guns now in Australia than there were at the time of the Port Arthur massacre. That is not good enough.
A recent report by the Australia Institute shows that approximately 2,000 firearms, 2,000 guns are stolen each year, averaging one every 4 hours.
Even before Bondi, the community had been calling for action on gun control. Polling by the Australia Institute showed that around 70% of Australians think gun laws should be strengthened to make it harder to get a gun. The tragedy of Bondi means we must not ignore those calls any longer.
So, Bill, what does Australia Institute research actually show about guns in our community and what's happened to guns in our community since Port Arthur?
Last year, the Australia Institute came out with the really quite surprising finding that the number of firearms in Australia is greater than it was before the Port Arthur massacre. That research was based on the Australian Institute putting in a bunch of different freedom of information requests across each state and territory, because there was no single figure of how many guns are actually in Australia. The federal government has since produced its own figure in the wake of the Bondi massacre, but last year, the only research that was there was the Australia Institute's. That, I think, really points to why a national firearms register is so important and why it's so upsetting that we're 29 years on from the firearms agreement and it still hasn't been established.
Yeah.
No doubt the strongest hate laws that have ever been in place in Australia have now been achieved. That is a good thing.
The choice the Liberal Party makes this morning, as we have always done, is to stand with the Jewish community and law-abiding Australians. It's the choice to be constructive, to pass this legislation.
The government has not been able to convince my party room, the National Party, that adequate safeguards are in place.
This bill will increase division and it will silence legitimate criticism of foreign nations undertaking human rights abuses. This is a very scary bill.
The hate speech laws, I do want to just explain to people what provisions we know were in that legislation.
Yeah, so key among the provisions is the ability to ban groups when they engage or advocate hate crimes based on race, nationality or ethnic origin. That'll be done with ASIO and the Attorney General working together without the requirement that the government follow procedural fairness in that process.
What does that mean?
That you can't appeal on the basis that they've been arbitrary, that they've rushed it, that they haven't read their materials, that kind of thing.
So basically, once you're labelled with this or, become part of this kind of legislation or subject to it, there's no avenue for you to really appeal it based on its unfairness.
Very limited, I would imagine.
Okay.
The Parliament can disallow it, but that would mean that the government would have to change its mind if they were the people who did the hate group designation, because they, more often than not, control the House.
Yeah.
But that's one of the key problems with this legislation is that the government is saying, okay, this is going to apply to Nazi groups and radical Islamic terrorist groups. But the legislation is so broad, and because it's been rushed through, we haven't actually even investigated the unintended consequences.
To explain for listeners, a disallowance motion is where the government's been given a power to make its own rules, but the parliament can step in and stop that from happening if they can reach agreement. And I think it's still unclear exactly how that's going to work.
But what was immediately obvious to lawyers, civil libertarians, people perhaps on different sides of the ideological spectrum, like the IPA and even the Nationals who split from the coalition on voting for this, is that you just need a state police to say, look, we think this group is a problem. Then you just need ASIO, the Director General, to predict future potential behaviour and say, yeah, look, maybe down the track, this group could potentially turn violent. That is all a minister needs to say, okay, this is going to be a hate group.
Yeah.
And then once that is made, there is no recourse. And anyone who supports that group in any form, so donations, slogans, paraphernalia, joining, recruiting, processing amongst them, can also be charged under these laws. And we've seen what has happened with the UK, which has similar laws when it's come to people protesting Palestinian causes or against genocide. Palestine Action was determined to be a hate group by the UK government, and people who have been out protesting with Palestine Action, have been arrested just for sitting there holding a sign saying, I support Palestine Action.
Yeah.
The Attorney General, Michelle Rowland, appeared on 7:30 on the night that the laws passed.
If a group is suggesting that Israel is guilty of genocide, what other measures or factors would need to be met before they can be banned?
Well, under the provisions that are now before the Parliament, there would also need to be able to demonstrate that there are, for example, some aspects of state laws that deal with racial vilification that have been met as well. So the point I would make here, David, is that whilst these provisions have changed in response to the negotiations that have been undertaken with the opposition, they still represent a tight set of laws that can be implemented and are capable of interpretation, not only by a court, but also by our agencies.
She was unable to say whether supporting an anti-genocide protest could potentially lead to a hate group designation and then also being charged. Unable to say whether under these new laws, criticising the nation state of Israel for its policies could potentially land you in the territory where you would be looked at under this hate group laws.
And being subject to these hate legislation, it's now criminal. That's the outcome of this legislation. So you can go to jail for being part of these kinds of organisations or for engaging in what is deemed to be, I guess, hate speech. Amy, you've talked about how that's been applied in the United Kingdom, seeing thousands of arrests and things like that. And it's quite it's a criminal standard normally does not apply, for breaches of the Racial Discrimination Act, for example. Normally those have been dealt with as, civil penalties. Bill, I'm really conscious that these laws, we've already talked about how there wasn't much time for them to be inquired into, and we did see some changes yesterday as they made their way through the Parliament. I mean, how much scrutiny has actually been applied to this, as Amy said? How much do we know about the unintended consequences?
Well, I think, as Amy pointed out, I don't think the government knows what the consequences of this legislation are, let alone the rest of us. The parliamentary committee looking into these matters was given about a week to hand down its report, including 2 days of hearings and 2 days for people to make submissions. Despite that limited time frame, they apparently received over 7,000 submissions. But to give you a sense of how rushed they were, they didn't get time to publish more than 200 of those 7,000 submissions. You can imagine they didn't spend much time reading them either. And the committee's report is a political document. It anticipates the negotiations that were going on behind the scenes with the government and the Greens and the coalition. It's also worth mentioning that committee, which will be responsible for reviewing these laws in the future, is limited to major party membership only. The crossbenchers who are asked to pass the laws weren't allowed to participate in the review of those laws, nor will they participate in the review in 2 years' time either. So we're talking about a very limited level of scrutiny, only on the original bill, not the changes, from a committee that didn't have the chance to figure out what might come of this.
And I know that, for example, David Pocock was explaining today that, he only got this legislation yesterday, and then with all the changes, he just felt he simply could not vote for it because he really didn't know what was in it. The coalition itself originally was going to oppose it, Amy, and then backflipped, and the Nationals opposed this, but the Liberals passed it after doing a secret deal with the government. I mean, the politics surrounding this as well, just take me through the coalition, I guess.
Yeah, the coalition is really interesting on this because it really highlights that the internal fractures that followed the coalition into the summer have not gone away. There was a moment of unity with the coalition in the wake of Bondi around, the politicisation of what happened in Bondi, and that helped extend Susan Lee's leadership because many people predicted that she would not last the summer, and indeed her colleagues were openly speaking to any journalist that they passed about not expecting Susan Lee to last the summer. She did, largely because Bondi gave them something to unite around. And then there was the moment where the coalition was calling for Parliament to be recalled, calling for the hate speech laws, calling for stronger vilification protections, but only for certain elements of the community. In this case, it was Jewish Australians, which obviously have been victims of increased hate and anti-Semitism. But constitutionally, you can't just single out one group of people as deserving more protection than others. And the coalition did not want to extend protections to the LGBTIQ community, for example. So we started seeing early splits in the unity with the coalition. Then when the hate speech bill came out, the coalition was vehemently opposed to it. They were saying, no, this vilification goes too far, mostly because it would mean that people who were receiving hate in other communities outside of Jewish Australians would also, have access to these laws. And that upset people on the conservative side of politics who thought that that was going too far. And so they split, and then the vilification sections were removed. And Susan Lee then entered into secret negotiations with Anthony Albanese. It was one-on-one, leader to leader, to get the bill basically re-energised. She made agreements through negotiation, including that the government would have to speak to the opposition leader before they made this designation, which she was waving around as a win yesterday. It's not consult, it's just tell them we're going to do this. And as a couple of people in Labor pointed out, that could be Pauline Hanson or Barnaby Joyce, the way that the polling is going, but that's a side matter. The Nationals, though, were not happy because Matt Canavan, in particular, who is undergoing pre-selection in Queensland as we speak, was hearing a lot from constituents that this bill was going to have a lot of unintended consequences. And they don't mean for people who are standing against genocide. They mean people who perhaps are arguing against trans rights or arguing against, other conservative ideologies, that they could be caught up in this bill. So they split. They didn't vote for it in the House. They abstained. And then in the Senate, as they did the late night bill, Bridget McKenzie led the revolt, basically saying we cannot support these. She blamed the government for not giving them a cohesive piece of legislation that could receive bipartisan support. But that was ignoring the fact that the Liberals were well on board for this. And they didn't abstain. They voted against it. David Littleproud came into the chamber at one point and sat behind them. They didn't cause too much of a ruckus. But the consequences of this, while they're trying to play them down, Bridget McKenzie is a member of the Shadow Cabinet. The Shadow Cabinet had agreed to pass these laws. She's broken the Shadow Cabinet solidarity.
So traditionally, she would be required to resign.
You would think. It's one of the reasons Andrew Hastie stepped back from Susan Lee's cabinet. She's just sort of saying, this is my position, but hasn't indicated that she would resign. David Littleproud now knows that he has those internal fractures within his party and that they did not leave with Barnaby Joyce. Another member of the LNP, Cole Boyce, who's the member for Flynn, is openly talking about joining One Nation.
Yep.
And we're starting to see the coalition fracture internally again, while also showing that David Littleproud and Susan Lee do not have authority over their party room. And that is going to have further ramifications for them beyond these laws.
Yeah. Moving back away from the politics for a second, we had a question here from Dale on the live blog, Amy. I'm not sure whether you or Bill would want to answer this, but the question is, are the laws retroactive and is that up to state or federal police? Is liking a post from the United Nations about a genocide considered supporting hate speech, or will it put me on a list?
So as I understand it, the designation of a hate group can look backwards on their performance and behaviour prior to these laws being passed, but the criminal offence nature wouldn't be retrospective. So you'd be looking at designating the group based on past performance, but the offence based on current behaviour. And the scope wouldn't be so broad as to capture liking a United Nations post. But certainly it runs the risk of being broad enough to capture kinds of behaviour that we aren't anticipating yet.
Yeah. So, Amy, we've seen even in the wake of tragedy that politics never stops. And, you know, we've, I think, talked about on the podcast before the fact that probably the coalition's vote hasn't hit rock bottom yet. And certainly this week we saw a couple of different polls say that One Nation is now outpolling the primary vote of the Liberal Party. What does that mean for the coalition?
It means the coalition's vote hasn't bottomed out and they potentially could lose even more seats at the next election. And Labor could still gain more seats depending on how those preference flows. I mean, we're still 2 years out from an election. But I know that they are worried. I know that in the event of a three-cornered contest in some seats, including Maranoa, which is David Littleproud, the leader of the Nationals, this is a potential issue because, he got over 50% of the vote, but One Nation at different points, I think 2016, they got about 18% of the first primary vote, and Labor preferences in that seat have broken more to One Nation than they have to David Littleproud. So that is an issue if this polling holds and is replicated at the voting booth. It also means that the coalition has continued to move further and further to the right for no gain. In fact, they've lost ground. So despite trying to ape One Nation in what it's talking about, cover the same areas, I mean, there's elements of the coalition that are fundraising to do anti-migration campaigns at the moment and really ramped that up in the wake of Bondi. They still have not won any of the vote that they are chasing and in fact have lost people who have previously voted for them to One Nation. Barnaby Joyce is in the background openly gloating, gleeful about everything that is happening. He sees this, if not as the Barnaby bounce, but as vindication that his position in the coalition was right. He is a better communicator than most of the people in the coalition. Pauline Hanson is a better communicator than most of the coalition because they don't have to back up anything that they're saying.
Yeah.
And they're not a party of government. So they don't have to be serious about negotiations. So they can just say, this is bad. You should be angry about it. And people go, yeah, we're on board with this. The coalition can't do that because they are still a negotiating part of this party, of this parliament. But also they don't have a cohesive message. You still have people saying, oh, well, we're not entirely against migration, just certain elements of it, while other people are saying, nope, stop all migration completely.
Yeah.
With that lack of cohesiveness, they have no authority from either leader. They do not have authority over the branches. They do not have authority over the executive, and they cannot come to an agreement about what their policies should be I think that we're just going to see the coalition fall and fall further and further into the political abyss. I don't think the coalition is going to make it out of this as one party. And I don't think that the Liberal Party will see out the decade. I think we'll see something emerge in centre-right politics in its place, which will have many of the same ideals and principles as the Liberal Party once purported to have. But this version of it, I would say it's terminal.
It's looking pretty rocky, and I guess we'll see how they intend to deal with that internally by the end of today, after a bunch of them didn't vote the way that the coalition was supposed to, and what they do about it.
Yeah, but I mean, the wider issue I think for people to be aware of is that if Labor sees opportunity to snap up some more coalition seats, it's going to be in some of those outer suburban, inner regional ones like Longman and those sorts of seats.
Yeah.
That also means that you'll probably see the Labor Party adopt more right positions, or at least not do any of the progressive reforms that are in their own platform.
Yeah.
So we are shifting the Overton window even closer to the right with all of these shenanigans as the coalition tears itself apart.
Yeah. Bill, you wrote a piece for The Point about support for One Nation. Amy was obviously talking about the fact that given the way the polls are going, One Nation, its primary vote has exceeded the coalition for the first time, or the Liberal Party for the first time. What does this mean, the support for One Nation looking forward? How do we think it will actually translate?
Well, some advice I was given early in my days at the Australia Institute was never believe one poll, always believe three. And we've got an accumulation of polls now that point to a real increase in One Nation's polling results, and mostly at the expense of other right-wing parties. But Labor's vote appears to be eaten into as well. The first question, I guess, is what that means for the single seat races that play out across Australia, where you can poll very well, but if you don't make it into the final two, your preferences will influence the decision, but you won't be up for election yourself. There are kind of thresholds that the One Nation national vote could pass that we'd expect to start seeing them be competitive in a handful of seats.
Yeah.
By the time you're matching the coalition's primary vote, the number of seats where you're competitive is a significant portion of the 150 up for grabs. But there's a couple of patterns in One Nation's performance in the past that suggests that this polling is unlikely to be the result that they'll get at the election. Dissatisfaction in the middle of the term may not hold for the 2 years until we get another federal election. And One Nation is a much smaller and less developed operation than the Liberal and National parties are. So can they find candidates who are compelling in their electorates? Can they get volunteers to campaign and hand out how to vote cards? Can they raise the money to run the kinds of tens of millions of dollars that the major parties pour into their election campaigns? All of those suggest that One Nation's polling results now, while real, may not manifest at anywhere near the same level when we actually get the election in 2 years' time.
Yeah. So while the polls are looking good, it's quite a way from the election. We've got a long way to go yet. The government has obviously been talking a lot about community unity in the wake of the Bondi massacre. How much closer to that idea of community unity do you think we are following the passage of these two bills this week?
I don't know that we're much closer at all to community unity. Even the fact, as Amy mentioned, that some of the state coalition governments are defecting from the agreement and aren't willing to participate in a buyback, as all governments did after the 1996 agreement with John Howard. That's concerning and suggests a more febrile politics, as does the lack of unity even within the coalition or even within individual parties within the coalition. I guess I'm also concerned by the use of unity or divisiveness as the yardstick. In a liberal democracy like Australia, we should be aiming for people's lives to be safe and free of hate, but not that community division will not exist.
Yeah.
We'll always have disagreement, but we need it to be respectful and peaceful and so on. But divisiveness is getting thrown around as an abstract accusation levelled against anyone that particularly right-wing commentators disagree with, rather than something that reflects a risk to people in the community.
Yeah, and is a result of living in a liberal democracy.
Exactly.
I guess, what do you make of this week and the events of the last few days in terms of strengthening or weakening Australia's democracy?
It's been a pretty sorry affair from the point of view of not just democracy as a general principle, but also the actual mechanical operations of the parliament. I'm quite a defender of parliamentary processes in general, but they work best when multi-party committees are given a great deal of time to consider a variety of viewpoints, when there's serious and competitive debate in the parliament. And we saw little of that this week. There simply wasn't enough time to consider the legislation. I think from a political point of view, the Albanese Labor government did very well in splitting the bills and pursuing one with the Greens and one with the Coalition. It's a reminder that when we talk about the balance of power, and in the Senate the Greens hold the sole balance of power, that's only when the opposition and government disagree. When they do agree, as in the case of the hate speech bill in the end, the crossbench is ruled out altogether. That gives governments a lot of freedom to approach policy in different ways. That's good for the most part, but when it means that debate is cut short, it's not good at all.
And yeah, traditionally speaking, when parliaments rush through legislation, really doesn't matter what it is. It normally leads to poor outcomes. It's definitely not the best way to approach things. And Amy, I asked Bill really about unity in the wake of these laws and since the Bondi attacks, something that the government has really been calling for, but we haven't seen much evidence of. I guess following this week of Parliament, do you think Jewish Australians will feel any safer after the passage in particular of the hate speech laws? Do you think the Australian community should feel safer?
It's a really difficult one to answer because, I mean, I can't answer for Jewish Australians, and they're not a monolith. It's not just one view in the Jewish communities. The Jewish people that I have spoken to and who have reached out to me do not feel safer, and that is understandable because hate is prevalent in Australian society. Anti-Semitism is real. Islamophobia is real. Racism is real. We're about to go into, into Australia Day, where Indigenous Australians are once again going to be threatened with a lot of hate. And so these laws, you can't legislate hate away. You can make it worse.
Thanks for joining me, Amy and Bill.
Thanks, Eb.
Thank you.
Our latest book from Australia Institute Press, A Time for Bravery, is available now. Usually $35.99. You can save $5 by using the code POD5, and you can order that now from australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. You can also pre-order Amy's forthcoming book, Where It All Went Wrong, The Case Against John Howard, published by Simon & Schuster. The link for that is also in our show notes. And also I'm going to give a shout out to Amy's fabulous live blog. You can now find that at thepoint.com.au. And Amy was up until the wee hours last night live blogging all the amendments and votes in the Senate as they happened. So if you happen to miss all of that debate, you can catch it still on The Point on the live blog. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 21st of January, 2026. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.